What's up, guys? So if you work for an agency or group practice, you often just use whatever initial intake paperwork that your employer asks you to use. But how do you know what to include in the initial intake form if you're running your own practice? Well, in this video, I go over some things you might like to consider including in your intake form if you're running your own private practice. Breathing is really hard. I'm 34 weeks pregnant. Breathing is not getting easier. Welcome to Private Practice Skills. I'm Dr. Marie Fang, psychologist in private practice. I post videos offering tools I learned the hard way about starting and growing private practice so that you don't have to. So y'all have been asking me to cover documentation in private practice since pretty much forever, and I've been putting it off since you've been asking me to do it. When I really sat down and thought about it, I realized I've been putting it off because there's way too much information to cover about documentation in one video. So what I decided to do is I'm going to break down documentation into a series so you can look forward to having more videos about documentation come out in the future. For today, we're just going to talk about how to collect your client's basic information in the initial intake form. So what is the intake form? This form is included in the initial paperwork packet, whether you have clients complete it at home before your first session, or maybe they arrive a little bit early and fill it out in the waiting room before you meet the first time. The initial intake form covers basic information that you need about the client in order to do therapy and also to gather any logistical information such as what you need in order to bill insurance. There's no specific requirements of what you have to ask in this form, so it's really up to you to tailor it to your practice and your client's needs. When you're developing your intake form, I suggest you run through this list and only include those items that are relevant to your practice. So it's not about getting as much detail as you possibly can from your clients, but rather focusing in on some key information to give you a quick assessment before you get started. There's also a good chance that there may be some items that are relevant to your practice and your specialty that you'd like to include in this form, which I don't go over in this list. With all that said, here are some items you might like to consider including in your initial intake form. Number one, identifying information. So you might like to include things in this section like your client's name, date of birth, and social security number. If you work with minors, this is also a great place to get the identifying information of their legal guardians. Number two, contact information. Now, I do think every intake form needs to ask about some type of contact information so that you can reach your client. You might consider asking about phone number, email address, and their snail mail address, and consider adding a checkbox next to each of these to ask if it's okay for you to utilize that contact method and if it's okay to leave a message. Number three, demographic information. So depending on the type of work that you do, you may find it helpful to ask questions about demographic information such as gender, race, sexual orientation, faith orientation, marital status, etc. Now, for some of you, this may actually be triggering information to ask of your client, in which case you might refrain from putting it on your intake form and simply wait to ask about it in person. Number four, presenting issues. Now, even though presumably your client has already shared with you their presenting issue during your initial phone screen, I've found that sometimes clients will withhold certain information about their presenting issue, sometimes really critical information about it, and then just share about it casually in the intake form. So I like to include this in my intake, and I also make sure I glance at their answer to this question before we meet face to face so that I know what to ask about if there's anything relevant that's come up. You might also consider whether you'd like to ask about the history of this presenting issue, things such as onset of symptoms, and anything that they've done to try to address the issue. Number five, current context. It might be helpful to get information about employment status, income, relationship issues, who's living in the home, etc., in order to give you a bit of context surrounding their presenting issue. Number six, referral source. This is a great opportunity for you to collect some data about how this client found you so that you can tailor your marketing strategy accordingly. Number seven, mental health history. This is where you might ask if your client has had any history of seeking mental health services in the past. You might also inquire about whether this client has any known family history of mental health diagnoses. Number eight, physical health. Of course, we know that physical health overlaps so much with mental health. So you might consider asking whether your client has any medical diagnoses as well as whether they're taking any medications at this time. Some people also like to ask for their physician's contact information and when their most recent physical exam was. Number nine, Number nine, insurance information. If you plan to bill insurance, this is the form where you want to ask all the relevant questions that insurance needs from you in order for you to bill them. So make sure you get information directly from each insurance panel that you're on as far as what client information they need from you so that you can have it all consolidated in this one form. Number 10, safety assessment. Though it's absolutely necessary to do an in-person safety risk assessment, it can also be helpful to inquire about risk of self-harm, suicide, and harm to others in the intake form. Sometimes clients are more willing to disclose on paper than they are face-to-face. And number 11, emergency contact information. It's helpful to have an emergency contact in case of emergency, and then you can also touch base in person with your client to clarify what merits an emergency and what type of relationship they have with this individual. Now, depending on your style and the clients that you work with, you may decide to consolidate key information into a single page form, or you may work up a more detailed questionnaire in order to get all the information you can to inform treatment. Personally, I've opted for a quick one-page form, saving additional information for once we meet face-to-face. This is because there's so many barriers that keep clients from scheduling an initial session that I don't want a giant intake packet to be an additional barrier to them. So I try to keep my intake packet something that they can complete in less than 10 minutes. Thus the one-page intake form. Well, I hope you found this video helpful as you develop your intake form. Let me know in the comments if there's additional items you inquire about in your intake form that I didn't cover in this video. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well. Today's video is brought to you by TherapyNotes.com. TherapyNotes helps with scheduling, notes, and billing so that you can spend more time with your clients and less time on back office paperwork. Click the link in the description of this video to get 2 months to try it for free with no commitment. Oh, it's la cucaracha. Isn't that song about a cockroach? Oh, the ice cream truck is back. Breathing gets harder, even I know that. Thanks, Sarah Bareilles, you understand pregnancy.